Today we've got Stephen Hallowell with us, who is going to help with presentations. He's one of the experts in New Zealand, though I should have said he's the expert in New Zealand. We're going to start with Pauline's going to give an introduction about how we're going to run the process, and she will introduce Stephen better than what I just did then. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Pauline.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, apologies. Sorry, I didn't hear that from Councillor Dowsing, and who else was it? Councillor Stoltz? Was he? Well, I assumed that the Mayor wouldn't be here because that's why I was asked to chair the meeting. But anyway, we'll find out when they come. But yes, we would like senior management here, and as you say, one's walked in. But anyway, we'll carry on with their
So what you've got briefing papers. You've got two sets of papers that were given to you a little bit late. Next time we hopefully have several days beforehand, so you have a chance to assimilate that. But the idea is you've got the presentations that were the 3 or 4 presentations which were on Docs on Tap. But then there was also the briefing papers, which you had them in one block under Docs on Tap. And that was to give more detail, more context with the presentations. And that is to allow for any new councillors that come in after the elections, that they have the full information. It's easier for them to pick up where you are at this stage. In terms of the presentation, I can just get straight into it. And that's the first one that says, if you have got it on the things and you were looking at, it's a policy review, but we'll have, there we go. That's it, policy review and timeframes. So as part of what was saying that the keys to a successful revenue and financing review is that, as it says, it's robust elected member engagement. And that's part of that is actually understanding the challenges and the consequences of changing the rate. And that's why we're giving a fairly robust, and everybody has that information on our basic principles as we stand to begin with. Also, the robust community engagement is so that we can start talking early and there is an informed community with the debate, and that's also likely to deliver a better result in the term of things. And then it's good, clear information, and that means in simple, plain English, that they can spell out to the ratepayers the changes, what they mean, and why the review is happening. And that allows to have a wide range of views as needed to support any rating changes when it's finally made. The key drivers for this particular review, there was concerns about ratepayer affordability, and under the ratepayer affordability umbrella was looking at the long-term projections of what we are doing, how we currently relate, and what is the impacts that it may have on the community over a longer period of time. So it's checking up against that as part of the process. We've also known that there are issues in our rating base, and it's looking at, okay, that's one of the other drivers that was part of the review. And it was, excuse me, just can't see without the glasses. And it was also identified that when we started this process, it was going to be a principle-led process in looking at that. Is it still what we had in the existing frame, and is that still relevant to what you have today? And obviously, the other requirement is that every 3 years, and even though we perhaps only touched on it at the beginning of the long-term plan process 2018, there is a requirement every 3 years to review the revenue and financing, even if it's just to say it's all okay, we're keeping it there, but we're now having a chance to review it. And we also, as it said, within that review, because the time leading into the last LTP wasn't enough to do the full comprehensive information, that we gave a commitment that we would start this process as soon as we possibly can, so that when the new revenue and financing was reviewed, it was ready to go into the next LTP.
Just to interrupt you there, have you got a question?
I do.
Councillor
Sorry to interrupt
Adelbrandt?
you, Pauline. Thank you for that. I was just interested to know whether the review drivers in this season are different from previous drivers, or if they've just been the same kind of reasons for that, for this, or in this space. Sorry.
I think we started off with some of the issues, but they came compounding specific issues of our roading. Yeah, and that was one of them. But then when we started to look at others, we found that there were that needed a more comprehensive review to see where the interrelationship, because we have such a targeted rate system. So if you change one without changing some of the others, you could not be addressing the whole of the situation. So it was looking at, okay, let's start and do the comprehensive review when we do this process. So as it conceives what the sort of the process, it's a comprehensive review and it is in several stages, and it's tried to adopt as a bit of an agile approach to the project management. We've got more details obviously in early stages, but as we progress and there's maybe other emerging issues that we perhaps didn't identify at this stage, we'll develop the plan in different stages as we go along. So the focus pre-election was basically for information only, because you would have to go through the process again if there's a new council coming into it, and you'd have to, some of the decision makings which you may decide now may be overturned in a new election after the elections. The original ones where you had sent out earlier was that you would have 3 workshops before June. The middle one, we found that we didn't need it with the contents that we actually had. And so we have reduced it to this one, which is today, which is fairly comprehensive. It's quite a intense amount of information that you have got. The workshop 2 starts with the issues and the opportunities. And we had it early June, but because of probably resourcing, we're looking to see if the 20th of June is a new date, but that information will be sent out and updated to you. So again, that says the post-elections, we'll be looking at more into details and the discussion of the options and the decisions, including the principle-led that you now wish to have the rules as a basis of your revenue and financing. And then the long-term direction is that it comes into the next LTP. So some of the things which was on the briefing is just saying this is the process that we are. Basically, this workshop 1 is covering the planning and the context setting. This is for that information. 3, which is issues, identification and opportunities, will be workshop 2. And from there on, there's different parts that we'll have, and we will progress as each part unfolds. It's a bit hard to read here, but hopefully you've got your printout. You can see it a little bit better in that sort of the timing of it. The black one is obviously where there's election time, so there's a bit of a hiatus, but that allows us to get more information and evidence base. And the further part that there, it talks about the option development, rates modelling, review and remodelling. That is a period of December to June 20. It's a bit of a reiterative process. We come back, we look, we see what it does, and you come back to see each part of it rather than, and that takes a period of time. Fortunately, it also conflicts at the same time and the resources is for the next annual plan. So that's a little bit of a work in progress with the logistics of getting the modelling out. So that's my introduction to sort of what the framework is and how we are going to progress this. But I will introduce you to Stephen Halliwell, as we've just had a little bit of a beer. I'll give you a little bit more of a brief. So Stephen's going to sort of help and assist in the review and facilitate our process as we go through some of the workshops. He is an expert in local government rating. He's undertaken a number of rating reviews and in many councils over the last 19 years. This experience has led to the Society of Local Government Managers, or SOLGM, asking Stephen to author the guide to effective rating reviews. And effectively, that guide is for all councils to say what is good practice when you're actually doing a rating review. Most recently, Stephen has led 2 reviews for Hamilton City, the first being for the LTP 2015, and they change, which was a significant change in direction and to do it. It's quite if you think of the incidence rates, this would be one of them. And they changed from a general rate to a capital rate, and that over 10 years. Sorry, yes. Yes, and that was over a stage over 10 years. The second one in 2018 LTP, it was modifying their rating system to better provide for growth, to pay for growth. And that rating review was closely linked to the financial strategy objectives. Stephen's first job in local government job was at Papakura, and he's worked in central government, licensed trusts, hospitals, and obviously local government. For the last 10 years, Stephen's been consulting, providing financial information advice to the local government sector. He's also the chairman of the local branch of the Otago Chamber of Commerce, and he still plays senior cricket, which he reckons is pretty good. He's batting #1. So, so I'll leave it over to you, and I'll hand you over there. And you just, yeah.
Good afternoon.
Use your microphone.
Please ask a question on the previous presentation. I'm pleased to see there that this is just 2 workshops, because going by the report in the paper the other day, there's only 5 people sitting around this table that may be around in October. So it makes sense to just be doing the background information. Are we going to be packaging all of this information up so that when the new council comes in, all this information we've gone through will be sitting there ready for any new elected members to get up to speed? It's like a booklet.
Exactly. So the first part of it was why there was briefing papers associated with this, because why you talk to the presentation, you don't have the details behind it. So that's the first part of it. The second part will be attached with any of those things will be the current revenue and financing policy. You'll have the FIS statement. So they'll have the full package that goes with it. If they wish to watch, which is why we're live streaming, that is available to watch as well, because you're quite right, is an important concept to actually come up to speed, and the reason why we're doing this in depth, even though there's a depth of experience around the table, we want to make sure that everybody has got the same fundamental foundations to begin this process.
We're on to you.
Good afternoon. Funding framework. There's 3 presentations here. Probably spend a good portion of our time on the first one. So it's good to get that base, and the second 2 presentations we could probably do that in the last hour without any trouble sort of thing, maybe a bit less. So we'll see how we go.
Yep.
And along the way, there's an awful lot of talking at you, which something I'd rather not be doing, but it's the nature of this presentation. So questions and about that would be great.
Take questions as we go.
As we go.
Yep.
Yeah. So which one of these am I going to push?
Good question.
Arrows? Oh, there we go. Yep, cool. Right. So the funding framework is embedded in the Local Government Act in subpart 3, and it's a whole bunch of sections there all together. And in terms of what we're doing, I'll put some ticks on that slide, beside the ones that are 2 ticks for those that are more relevant, 1 tick for those that are somewhat relevant, and a dash for those that are not particularly relevant to what we're doing at the moment. Just a wee typo there with section 108. Should have 2 ticks beside it. Just the way the words wrap there. So we'll go through each of these component parts as part of the presentation. So we'll start with the balanced budget requirement. And simply, revenues must equal expenses. You're familiar with this. Your annual report has a statement in it. Accounting is, accountants as a profession don't do themselves a great deal of service because we've got many ways of calculating a balanced budget. That's what my 3 piles of stones are supposed to represent, is that there's many ways of calculating a balanced budget. And the legislation has 2 ways within the legislation, and then councils often have an additional way of measuring it themselves. So the first principle in the section 100 is that revenues must equal expenses, and that is taken in the pure accounting terms of the profit and loss statement, or as we call it now, the Statement of Comprehensive Revenues and Expenditure. And most councils would expect to have a surplus. The idea of the balanced budget is it balances. But you have a surplus in an accounting statement because you've got capital revenue, for example, coming in the revenue, and the expense for the capital revenue doesn't sit in expenses, it sits straight onto the balance sheet. And so that's why you have a surplus. The second measure in the legislation for a balanced budget comes in what comes from the Local Government Financial Prudence Regulations, and those green and black graphs, maybe orange graphs that you see in the disclosure statement in your LTP and your annual report. The government, in their wisdom, chose a different method of calculating the balanced budgets in that one, and they take out some revenue and make some adjustments to that one, and they say that we all should be above the line. It's interesting, they take out some capital revenue, but not all capital revenue in that calculation. And then the third calculation that you're familiar with is the one that sits in the middle of your financial statements, the balanced budget one that comes to 0. And that's where your staff have gone through and very carefully taken out all those items that aren't relevant to the funding in the current year. And that's the one that is developed locally here that shows that you really truly do balance the revenue you're collecting with the expenses that you're paying in that year. So it's a very confusing concept for people who aren't accountants, and I apologise on behalf of my profession for that. I think understanding that your local one and the importance of that is probably key to understanding. So along the way in our revenue and financing policy review, we're going to make decisions that could affect the outcome of that, because we're going to make decisions about how we fund and when we fund and things like that. So that's the relevance of the balancing the budget requirement. And we'll go to financial management. We don't have to balance the budget. The legislation says that. It says that we have to be prudent, and sometimes it's prudent not to balance the budget. And I gave the example of capital revenue. You know, it's prudent that we accept our NZTA subsidy and build roads, and that creates an accounting surplus. So when the Act talks about us being prudent, and the words in the Act promoting the current and future needs of the community, it's prudent to sometimes make a surplus, and it's prudent to sometimes make a deficit. And that all depends on the circumstances of the community, the circumstances of the council, the time is also part of determining prudence. I worked for a council some years ago where they got themselves in a bit of financial trouble, and some mistakes were made in preparing an LTP, and they ended up making year one a big loss. And so the only way they were going to fix things up was to have a 12% rate increase. No one likes a 12% rate increase. The rate increase would have been a whole lot higher, but we had a policy of not funding any depreciation. Now, the audit office would come down on us and say that's not appropriate. The current generation should be contributing to the replacement and renewal of assets. That's the prudent thing to do in the normal course of business. But in a year when you have such a massive rates increase, you've got to consider what's prudent for the community today as well. So you've got to balance the risk of future with the challenges of today. That's a pretty extreme example. They really were in a lot of trouble. In the LTP, in the annual plan that we produced, we called it a austerity depreciation funding policy, and there was a plan to get back to fully funding within 3 years. So there was a plan of a large rates increase and 2 more reasonably sized rates increase. I can't remember the exact numbers. They might have been around 7% sort of thing, over 3 years to get that council back to a position. We started funding depreciation. The Local Government Act, most councils started funding depreciation probably early 2000s. So our assets, some of our assets are 100 years old, and we haven't funded depreciation until then. So for those assets that are very old and the funding depreciation, then you're only going to part fund depreciation, and you're going to eventually have to borrow because you're not going to fully fund on an asset that's 100 years old at this time. So that's that's where we're at in that regard. So prudence is a decision for council to make on behalf of the community. And what's really important to understand is why you're making that call. It's probably part of your financial strategy. So the financial strategy is a key document in the development of a 10-year plan, and it says where we're going, where we're starting from, and where we're going to be in 10 years' time, and how we're going to get there. And you can't address a financial strategy. In fact, you're required to have a benchmark for rates, and you're required to have a benchmark for debt, and both of those things are key funding tools. So financial strategy and the decisions you make in your financial strategy and LTP going forward over the next 10 years are critical to what you decide around your funding policy. And in fact, I've created this diagram. Sorry, what? It's cheek. Created this diagram for the purpose of trying to explain the funding framework in its entirety. And And you can see there that I've wrapped the financial strategy right around all the policies because it touches on everything we do. The funding framework is complex. It's not linear. You can see in that diagram, I've got the arrows going backwards and forwards. There's no nice, we start here and we go through the steps and we end up with an answer. Inevitably along the way, we need to retract, go back and change some thoughts that we had initially. My experience with rating reviews is that while we go through the processes of the legislation, we can't lose sight of the end result. The bit that matters most to our community is what that rates bill looks like and how much each of us pay of that. And so it's really important that through the process we don't lose sight, and every now and then we'll go back and revisit some stuff as part of developing a set of policies that provide a coherent support for the funding choices we make along the way. Most of these boxes are statutory, and I've done that by way of colour. The dark purple boxes are the statutory ones, but there's a couple of good practice policies in there that fees and charges. The fees and charges schedule, you'll be used to that. It's not a statutory requirement, but it's a damn handy thing to have. The other one is rating policy, and I'll talk a little bit more about some rating policy. But essentially it's some stuff, again, that's very useful to have to create some transparency in what we're doing in rates, but it doesn't technically fall into one of the statutory policies.
Hang on, can you move, councillors, remember to use your microphones. Councillor Salts may not be aware we are live streaming.
I am aware, but I just forgot about the microphone. When you say it's not a statutory requirement, lots of times when we do set fees and charges, though, we are told and we know that some things are set nationally, though. Is that true?
Yes, no, so that's the setting of the piece. Yeah, this is a policy where they're all, we're used to a document where they're all together in one place for communication and reasons, not for the technical reasons of each line in there. Yeah, and we'll come to that. Statutory and non-statutory, there's something else that was on my mind. Doesn't matter. So the job of staff along this process is to help you work through the statutory stuff in order to get to the end and get to a solution that you and the community are comfortable with, while at the same time ticking all the boxes that's going to keep us out of trouble. That occasionally happens in some of these places because you've got something technically wrong. If you get it wrong, it can be costly. There are plenty of examples of the sector getting it wrong. We had Christchurch who forgot to technically get the penalties correct and had to get corrective legislation on that. We had any number of things that weren't correct in Kaipara that needed correcting legislation and court costs, subsequent court decisions and things like that. We've had DC policies overturned because of technical incorrectness with these policies. We've even had some fees and charges overturned because they haven't been compliant with legislative requirements as well. This is all since the 2000 set of legislation. Before 2000, the old legislation was very, very prescriptive, and getting it wrong was even more often than it has been now.
Councillor Marco Brown.
Just in that space then, you know, because statutory, we have to work within a set means, but we also within a democracy can push back to those statutory requirements and in a space where we see our region, you know, as its uniqueness. So sometimes those statutory requirements, we would say, oh, they're not working in our place. And then we talked about prudence before. So it's prudent that our policies are kept with, you know, changing frameworks too, because you could just change a policy when you ballsed it up. Well, you wouldn't, because it would be prudent or good, good work, outworking ethic-wise. But are those some of the other, you know, issues around when we're working towards a prudence fiscally under a democracy? You know, that's where you hear about these councils that, you know, don't agree on set things, and we have debate in house and rogue stuff happens.
Yeah, I think I'd sum it up that we must tick the boxes of statutory compliance. The consequences that some will challenge us, and the courts will rule that our revenue doesn't meet the requirements, and then we could have to refund it, or we go to the government and ask government to pass corrective legislation, which is another big bill you've got to pay, as well as significant disruption and stuff. So we will tick those boxes. The good thing about the legislation that we work with now, the 2002 set legislation, is that we have a lot of flexibility in what we can do. And sometimes that flexibility is a little bit convoluted, but I think in most cases we'll be able to find a way to get the right solution. Across the sector, every single council has very different rating policies, and so the legislation allows that flexibility. Yeah. So moving on to the revenue and financing policy, I'm just going to cover this lightly here because we've got another whole slide. We'll talk about revenue and financing policy in more detail. It sits at the centre of my framework for funding. It's a key policy document. It was errors in this document that was specifically addressed in a case called Neil Construction versus North Shore City Council that led to the court ruling that their DC policy in regard to a specific project was not compliant with the law because they hadn't got the elements of the revenue and financing policy correct. It's a revenue financing policy where, in the context of the funding framework, we will record what the funding principles are. They will be linked to what the direction of the financial strategy is. The revenue and financing policy must separately address operating expenses and how we fund those, and capital expenses and how we fund those. It must address and consider all 12 funding sources that are listed in the Act, and we'll come back to what those 12 funding sources are and how we use those. Only one of those 12 funding sources is rates. And then the really dry bit that is quite detailed that we have to go through is section 1013, often referred to as section 1013. Also, not in the legislation called the funding needs analysis, but the words of the Act imply a funding needs analysis. So we're using the term funding needs analysis, and later on in the presentation, you'll see it referenced as FNA. So it's a detailed piece of work that we'll go onto, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. So the funding needs analysis is a detailed activity by activity analysis of how we fund that activity. And there's 2 steps to it. There's what they call step 1, section 1013A, and step 2, 1013B. And it's a step 1 analysis that Neil Construction case failed to comply with. There's 5 things listed there that you must consider in considering the funding of an activity. And that is the community outcomes, who benefits, when they benefit, and that's now and in the future and things like that. Exacerbator pays. An exacerbator pays means the person that causes the cost. So the common example is the person who creates the waste pays for disposing of the waste. And the efficiency of having separate funding. Those aren't in any hierarchy in the Act, and each one must be considered equally. And that's where North Shore went wrong. They only considered benefit. How we do that consideration is all about, and how we protect ourselves is all about how we document it. So that's the job of staff, to make sure that we document the intentions of council, and that is that it's clear that we've considered all those factors. In your current policy, that results in a percentage that will be collected from rates. That's in your current LTP. The FNA step 2 says the council must consider the overall impact of any allocation of liability for the revenue needs of the community. And what that means is, having gone through your principle-based step 1, you can change it to whatever you like, so long as you're considering the revenue needs of the community. So that's...
Question, Jim. Are you saying that if we rate for a certain aspect, roading, rains, we can put it somewhere else legitimately?
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is if you do your step 1 and you decide that you're going to fund, use your example, roading, so you're going to fund, so your subsidy is 68%. So you're going to fund the balance of that from rates. You could, as a step 2 analysis, decide. I'm just trying to relate it to roading. So you've got to decide whether you're going to use a general rate or a targeted rate as part of that analysis under step 1. And so you might decide in step 1 that you'll do it all general rate, and then as a step 2 adjustment, you might decide that for a particular part of the roading activity, you might create a targeted rate. You might decide that in step 1, and therefore you don't need to decide in step 2, but it depends on how that process flows. A more common step 2 adjustment might be remissions policies, where you're using remissions policies to adjust your initial allocation of cost in the activity. So you don't address, you do your step 1 analysis, you come to a conclusion, you go away and do your rates modelling, and it's looking great except for this one small area. And so rather than throwing out the whole policy and going back to square 1, you put in place a remission to address that one small area. That's probably a better example of a step 2 adjustment. Another thing that would be a step 2 adjustment is some sort of adjustment to address some intergenerational equity. So you're addressing it over time. So rather than rating the full cost today, you're addressing it over time. One of the things I forgot to say under the balanced budget is I talked about deferring funding expenditure. There is an option to actually bring forward the funding. So you're actually rating in advance if something happened under that step, under that prudence option. Bit of discussion, does someone to?
Just on the exacerbator, I was just, in our region, we know a key exacerbator to roading is forestry industry. So ensuring that the exacerbator to that space is paying
That's an example, yeah.
more than maybe perhaps we originally forecasted in that space. So that's a consideration in the now, because of course we've got more logs coming on stream in the next years. Of course, that's been debated between industry and those holding that space, but that would be one key exacerbator within our region that's dialogued about a lot, but where we get to in that space is still pending lots more discussions, I believe, but that's what you mean by exacerbator, right?
Yep, that's a fair example. You guys right? Investment and liability policy. Not a strong link, but the choices you make in your investment policy will determine your income, and then the revenue and financing policy decides how you use that income. So there's a link on revenue, and on the other side of things, your debt liability management policy. Debt is one of the 12 funding sources that you can use. Typically, you'd use that on capital expenditure, but not always. And so what your liability management policy says about what you can and can't, or what you intend or don't intend to do with debt, and what you decide in your revenue policy and financing policy need to be aligned. Get those mismatched, and your coherent story that the policy framework needs to tell is weakened. Development contributions policy. My understanding is you don't use any financial contributions anymore, and if you were, you won't after this next LTP anyway. So the Neil construction case that I talked about before around development contributions led to legislation change that requires a second 1013 analysis to be done as part. So once you've decided something is funded from growth and it's going into the development contributions, as a second 1013 analysis within the development contributions policy over how you allocate the cost of growth that you're seeking to fund under the development contributions policy. But if your revenue and financing policy has failed to state that you will use development contributions for growth, then you've got a gap in your policy framework. And although there's not a case, in fact, a lot of what I'm talking about, there's not a lot of case law, but based on the case law that has been decided, if a judge can overturn a decision on the basis of only looking at benefit, the assumption is anything else that's supposed to be in the policy that's missing or not done right could lead to your revenue source being overturned. So that's why we're going to focus on covering off and ticking all the boxes in our revenue financing policy. So simple clause to have that under capital, the growth capital be funded from development contributions, refer to the development contributions policy that's set under 106. Miss it out, potentially you've got a problem.
Yeah, it's probably more for Pauline actually. Just on our finances, each finance and audit meeting, we go through and we have our finances and we have development contributions section in there. It's always zero, and there's a little sentence saying that the development contributions haven't contributed anything to the finances of this year. I whenever I see that, because I'm always looking at the development contribution, because I know full well that we have quite a lot of development happening around the place at the moment, with new builds and subdivisions, but we don't identify it in our financials.
I think at the moment we do, but probably it's a separate line in an income line. It says development contributions, but it's less than what we, yeah. And so when they were doing the modelling, they would say this is the likely flow of when we receive that based on kind of the modelling that was done. It gets a little bit of out of kilter if those development contributions didn't occur at those stages, and also the development contributions comes ahead of when the programming occurs. So we may have, where you've seen some development already occurred, we may have already received those fundings for it in prior years. So sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch with that. But yes, that whole policy and the sort of the funding of our development contributions in line with our planning is part of this review as well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, yeah. So we've got a bar that we don't reach each time, basically.
That's exactly. Right. So we have to do that as part of the review of what actually is and how it comes. Yeah.
Yeah. But when you're developing the budget, how can you know how much is going to income you're going to get from development contributions? That's a hard one.
Yeah. Okay.
Hard one that if you're relying on it to balance your books and it doesn't come in, you're in a bit of trouble. And we might want to look at Hamilton, who for the last 10 years has been deficit funding their everyday operating expenses because, in other words, they've been borrowing to buy the groceries because just before the GFC, they were budgeting on very high DCs that they then never got. And it's taken them a while to get back in the black, which they've achieved. And that's why those rate reviews, those 2 rate reviews that I worked on was quite important to them. Fees and charges, schedule. Like I said, the schedule itself is just a handy thing to have. It's not required. And with the internet and all those things, it's great to be able to go to one place on the internet and find these things. Fees and charges are surprisingly complex because everything has its own set of rules. Some fees and charges are set for us. Liquor is one of them that the sector gripes about all the time because it doesn't recover the cost. Some fees and charges we are allowed to set because we've given the statutory powers to set them. Some fees and charges might arise from our own bylaws. And other fees and charges come under our general competence that we have. And so we can operate a shop and we can operate a shop for a surplus. The only piece of legislation that allows us to specifically make a profit, though, in the regulatory space where we're restricted by regulation is the Waste Minimization Act. And that's because the Act recognises the executive pays principle. And so the Act is saying you can charge more than what it costs to dispose of waste in order to create an environment that forces people to stop creating that waste. But most of the other statutory fees are based around the concept of cost recovery. And that would be your Building Act and your RMA and those sorts of fees.
It can be cost recovery for absolutely everything. Activity, staff, time, travel, etc., can't it?
Yes. And the allocation
Travel and repeat visits, etc.
and the allocation of overhead becomes an interesting game that accountants might play in determining what the cost is. It's Special consultation. Some fees and charges still require a special consultation. So the Resource Management Act and the Food Act within the Acts require a special consultation process. Whereas everything else we do in an annual plan, for example, generally, unless it crosses a threshold in our significance policy, is a Section 83 consultation, which is slightly different. So we've got to make sure that we, for every one of those pieces of legislation, that the expert, the activity manager expert on that piece of legislation, that they understand the particular hoops that need to be jumped through in setting their fees and charges to ensure that we do all that, because there's an awful lot of them, hairdressers and all sorts of things.
Just a question, when we charge out a rate per hour for our services in different areas, is that consistent with all other councils around the country, or do they set that per hourly rate accordingly to their ability, the community to pay, or the environment they're in?
If it's in one of those statutory spaces like the RMA, then the legal test is around cost recovery.
Yeah.
But like I said, it's a dark art, and you've got to be careful with some fees and charges. You're an environment like Wellington City, Lower Hutt City, Porirua City. You've got to be careful how your fees and charges differ from your neighbours. It creates problems if you get that wrong.
That's right. Yeah, that's
I've experienced where landfills were receiving white goods for free in the Waitaki district, and so people were trucking truckloads of it up from Dunedin. This is going back a while, you know. So you had a zero fee. I've also heard of examples where councils that have, cemetery charges at a lower rate than their neighbours, and suddenly people from out of district are turning up buying plots. So while the legislation doesn't provide for that comparison, we do have to have some regard to it.
I realise a lot of those other different services are independent, but I was just meaning the like say in resource consenting, the hourly rate that is charged out per, for our staff to do their job. I mean, is there consistency around the country? I mean, I know we've gone through the fees and charges policy just recently and saw the other different pricings that people do, but I was just wondering with that per hour per rate, like some of our services, $175 per hour for some of our staff, and I'm just wondering if that is consistent with other. I don't
think I have anything to add to what I just said.
Councillor Dunn.
Just on some fees set by others, does that mean set by other pieces of legislation? Just when you say others, it sounds like it's someone outside there. Just wondering if you could expand on the others part, please.
Who sets the liquor licensing fees? We do. I thought they were set by central government.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's set through MPI, so there's central government fees, and depending on what the activities, some are set by local.
So that's the example that most commonly comes out, but there's probably some others.
If we had someone particularly clever, could we get challenged on this, if you put two statements together like exacerbator pays and most statutory fees can only recover costs, could we be challenged? And an example would be something we chase around a bit is the dog fees. Dog fees are to cover the fees of poor behaviour of some dog owners. And it's kind of like the ones that have got really good dog ownership are subsidising the bad owners. So do you think that's something, that sort of aspect of it could be challenged when you look at exacerbator pays and it can only recover costs?
So long as we've considered all those things, we then make our decision as to whether 100% of it's going to be funded from all dog owners, whether a portion of it is a public good and is going to be funded by maybe through general rates, or whether we're going to target dangerous dogs. I had a question the other day. Where was I? I was in a small community, Temuka. I was in a small community hall in Temuka doing an annual plan thing, and there's a question from a community board member about whether it was appropriate to be charging disabled. It's not disabled dogs because the dogs aren't disabled, but there's a word for it. Yeah. You know, so those are all choices that we have to make after considering all those things. It's very hard, and it's not usual to have a linear that this plus this equals that in terms of consideration. So long as we've documented the things we've considered, then it's appropriate for council to come to an answer. One of those other fees, the brands levy in your building, is set by brands.
So you're saying it's not the answer. There's no particular answer to setting the rates or fees or whatever. It's the method of doing it.
Yeah. Process is really important. But in the lead in, and I'll come back to this on some other slides, but in the lead in to section 1013, it's about council deciding what's appropriate. Rating policy, like I said, there's lots of things that aren't required to be in a revenue and financing policy and aren't required to be in a funding impact statement and aren't required to be in a rates resolution, but they're policy decisions that have been made and it's useful to document them. It's quite common in the sector that they haven't been documented, and they are the custom and practice of the rates officers. And along the way, you will have heard them. All those pieces of legislation require that, for example, you state the differentials, but it doesn't tell you how to calculate the differentials. So if you have differentials that are required to be, and it depends on how you choose to set your differentials, in Hamilton City, they have a residential and a commercial rate, essentially two differentials, and a certain percentage of the total rates must be collected from commercial. They're on capital value. The growth of the residential and commercial sectors isn't even, and so every annual plan there's a need to calculate how the actual differential number is calculated. That's something that they've now documented in the rating policy so that it's open and transparent to people in their community, particularly those organisations representing business who want to make sure that that calculation has been fairly representative of council's intent. Go back a few years and it was a mystery of the process of what the rating people did. So that's a policy that along the way I'm recommending that we create. Rates, remission and postponement policies. I think these are a really cool tool that give us lots of opportunity to deal with some of the challenging things along the way. I've done a number of rating reviews where submissions have come in and horrific results have led elected members to want to back away from what they put out. And I come back and say, well, what if we put this remission policy in And the remission policy might be a policy that allows the rate change to come in over 2 or 3 years so that the shock of the change isn't as much. Or it might be to say, hey, this particular group of people have a special interest. It's different, but the bulk of the policy works for the district. So for this little group, we'll make an adjustment. And you've got quite a comprehensive remissions policy, so you've been using it. The very cool thing about the remissions policy is all we have to do is talk about our objective and talk about our process for people collecting the remission. And we don't have to address any of the specific requirements of any of the other legislation, which means it's free for us to write the rules however we like. So while we may be constrained in rating law, for example, on how we set the rates, the remissions policy, we don't have those constraints. So there's few rules, and that's a cool thing.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So what's the difference? What's the point in terms of Local Government Act 202 and a council policy set in place by Council of Peers? What is the difference?
So the 202 Act isn't like the 74 Act in that it tells us we must follow processes and create policy that works for us and our community. And while in some cases it prescribes how we must create that policy, the end result policy is, in every council in many cases, is quite different. The 74 Act was very prescriptive in how you must do things, and you had to comply with the prescription. And for another client, I was trying to do some research the other day on a water scheme that had been around since the 30s. And along the way, I discovered these administration acts that had existed up to about 1992, and they ceased existing when the 2002 Act came in, essentially. And buried in the, I decided to whack Gisborne in, seeing as I was coming up here to see if Gisborne featured. In 1934, he featured in one of these acts because council had remitted rates on a property it wasn't lawfully allowed to remit rates. Was it a Boys Scout thing or something?
Yeah, it's one of the YMCA.
A YMCA? Yeah, yeah.
Just down the road,
So, you know, that's how prescriptive and the requirements. So that required special legislation through Parliament to deal with that kind of matter. So we don't have all that stuff. So long as we follow the process of creating a policy, we have incredible freedom around the policy.
So having heard that, what's the point of having local policy?
So the government has created a policy framework for us to have local policy so that we can meet our community's needs.
What you've just said counters that.
I don't think so.
You might.
I'm not intending to. I'm intending to say the same thing then. All right?
Yeah.
We are required to have a policy on remission and postponement of, all councils are required to have a policy on remission and postponement of rates for Maori freehold land. Other remissions and postponement policies are voluntary. Like I said, you've got quite a number of remissions policies. Postponements are less commonly used. And I'll just leave it at that for now. Funding impact statement. This is one of the joys of local government, is talking about funding impact statements, because whoever drafted the legislation in their wisdom called two very different things the same name, funding impact statement. So there's the funding impact statement that you have for each activity, and that's a financial statement in a prescribed form, which in your LTP, they all sit together, don't they? And in a lot of councils, you'll find them sitting with the activity. So that shows, it's sort of like a profit and loss, but with a bunch of its own rules as prescribed by the regulation for each activity. the funding impact we're talking about here, impact statement we're talking about here, is the statement that makes your rates legal. And it's a combination of three things that the funding impact statement must have. It must have the whole of council funding impact statement, which is that financial statement I talked about before, plus it must have a whole lot of details about rates, plus it must have the rates samples in it, a range of properties, a range of property types and a range of values. It's, as I've got in the diagram there, I've got it sitting at the bottom there in the diagram because it's the last thing that you do before you set the rates. So it's part of the LTP document. It translates the revenue financing policy, which is about all funding sources. It translates the rates part of the revenue financing policy into the detailed rates that you're going to collect. And then that translates into the rates resolution. Which is the formal setting of the rates. And the rates resolution, last step in setting the rates. Rates resolution must be consistent with the annual long-term plan, bearing in mind the first year of the long-term plan is an annual plan. It must include every rate. That means, that means if you've got a hall rate and then a half hall rate for certain types of properties and then a quarter hall rate for another property or something like that, that all three rates have to be in the rates resolution for them all to be legal. You can't just have the high one and have this other stuff buried away in the rating system that no one ever knows about except the person that's paying a quarter rate. Not relevant to your rates resolution here, but it has been that the metered water rate is left out. And that's a terrible mistake to make because that means your water rate isn't lawful and you might have to refund those. And I've said there it's too late to introduce new or different rates. It's recently, as about 4 years ago, a small rural council in the South Island got to the end of their LTP process and decided to set rates completely differently. And someone had to tell them that they couldn't do that. So they had some staff turnover issues and they weren't quite as well informed as they should have been. So the rates resolution is very much a formality, very technical document and very much a formality. Getting the rates resolution wrong is a big deal. That's the first place people go. Interesting enough, change in legislation last week. Up until now, the rates resolution was only ever published in an agenda and in the minutes. It now needs to be published on the website as part of some administrative changes to the Local Government Act that went through the other day. And it doesn't need to be sent to Internal Affairs. The Secretary of Local Government, was it Secretary of Local Government, or the Library and someone else, Parliament, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we used to have to send to Wellington. We don't need to send to Wellington anymore. We just stick it on the website instead. So that's the rates resolution, and all this chatter going on, the hour and a half has taken 40 minutes. So in summary, the framework is complex and the staff will guide you through the complexities of it, and hopefully as much as possible that you guys focus on the policy and the implications of that. There's lots of judgment, there's lots of opportunity to make choices, and we'll help you along the way with how to get to the result that you're looking for. It might be a bit convoluted sometimes, but we'll get there, I'm sure. Every council is different. Hamilton City Council essentially has one rate, a general rate. which is now capital value. They're going through a transition, so when they're not quite there, they've got a transition rate, which is land value. But when they get to the end of it, they'll have one rate, which is general rate. They have no water rate, no sewage rate, no refuse rate. I know they're not unitary, but the legislation allows it. Whereas other councils have lots and lots and lots of targeted rates. There are councils, lots more than you.
Yeah.
Well, you used to have lots more than you have now. I'm
Yeah.
told. Yeah.
Hamilton City have only got one general rate, then they must have a whole lot of little other rates that contribute to that, don't they?
No.
No?
No, they have an $11.50 gardens rate for the development of Hamilton Gardens.
The thing is, they're only a city council and that's,
Oh, they're very exceptional.
and a bit like Napier's the same in reality, but they're not the same in rating, but you're dealing with most rating units are quite equivalent. So therefore they don't need that targeted rate. They just don't need it because, you know, it's mostly just commercial or residential story. So there's no anything else.
Yeah, in fact, they did away with rural at the last rating review because they're such a tight thing. So that, yeah, they are unique, like you said. And I'm not, but the system allows that, and the system allows no general rate. There's no requirement to have a general rate, for example. So the point of this is not suggesting that we go anywhere here. The point is there's a whole range of options, and through the process, you'll decide where you want to sit within that range.
Was it Hamilton that had the differential commercial to residential, and is that very common?
Some councils use use as a reason for differentiating. Some councils are 100% capital value. Some councils use area a lot as opposed to use. So again, lots of options, lots of choices, advantages and disadvantages with each option. And as we go through it, when we get to solving problems after the election, we will be looking and talking about the advantages and disadvantages of all those choices.
Because that's the point you're raising in the seat sets, depending on who sat around the tables and some of the changing dynamics in that space that are happening in recent electorates, I guess, to some degree. I mean, one of our considerations in our rating forum speaks is often the rural urban, you know, who's paying for what, and those who feel comfortable to pay based on the interdependence consideration, or those who think, no, I don't use that, so I don't want to pay for that. So there's lots, as you say, to consider in the next whiles as to how we do this, and maybe some key changes that will work better. I just want to appreciate it's complex, and having come into this space, the finance and audit space has been the biggest learnings and undertakings for me as an individual. You know, in this space, it's huge. It's not an easy read if you don't have that accountant, you know, kind of sense of it. But there's been wonderful staff that keep us in check with the space. I very much appreciate it. So
yeah, I do. I talked about Hamilton. You know, the rating reviews that I've worked on, Hamilton's one extreme. Probably the other extreme that I worked on was Westland, who have, in my opinion, got one of the most aggressive rating systems in the country. Who created differentiated uniform rates for all their small communities, thus avoiding the 30% cap and creating that's the system that the councillors wanted to create. So I'm not in any way wedded to any system. I will help you find a system that works for you and your community.
That's
right,
it,
that's
Stephen.
that one.
Yep.
Any general questions around that before we move into revenue and financing policy?
Okay, Stephen, we can move on to the next one.
Yep. How do we change the slide? Do I just keep going? Is it next? No?
Somebody's escaped.
No, we're just trying to find where they've got it loaded.
There we are.
There you go. Sweet, she's into it.
Well done, Yvette.
Yeah.
Right, we'll look at the 2018-28. We'll just sort of overview what's in your current revenue and financing policy. Not going to form an opinion on anything in it. It's just a refresher of what's in your current policy. We'll look at the issues and challenges of the policy in the next workshop. So like I said, in terms of policy framework, the revenue and financing policy sits at the centre of that group of statutory policies that we have there, and is developed in an iterative sort of way. So the rules are in section 102. So we must address in 1, the operating expenses and the source from the sources listed in the subsection 2, and we'll come to that. And we also must do the same for capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is a whole lot harder to do because it's often project by project that you'll have a different choice of funding mixes. So we've got to design a policy that allows that flexibility to probably have a standard process for run-of-the-mill capital projects, and then we get something big. And I think wastewater is going to be a big one for you. Probably develop a specific policy for a project like that. We've got to address the sources of funding that are listed. And then we've got to identify in the policy how we've complied with section 1013, which is our funding needs analysis for each activity. And if we change the revenue and financing policy, it's got to be audited in a significant way. And your LTP, funny piece of legislation, the LTP must contain the adopted revenue and financing policy. So it used to be that you adopted an LTP, and doing so you adopted a revenue financing policy because it was part of the LTP. Now you must adopt your LTP separate, your revenue and financing policy separate from the LTP, and then include it in the LTP.
Question around that, Stephen. If
Yep.
you had a significant policy change, would you then have to go and then consult with the LTP, which may be affected quite dramatically by the change of financing policy?
Yeah, I think that clause, and it's the sort of thing you get legal advice on at the time. But that clause that requires the adopted revenue financing policy to be in an LTP effectively means you're doing an LTP amendment.
Yeah.
If you're going to make a big change anyway, you would want to do an amendment, because otherwise every time you did an annual report, you'd be having to explain variances that were as a result of policy change.
Yeah.
So the reason The Solgan best practice advice, which has been taken up in the development of this program, is that you actually do your big revenue and financing policy review the year before the LTP. 2 reasons. One of them is it gets the policy out of the way. And the other reason is rates is generally not the appropriate right conversation to have with your community and your LTP. The conversation in your LTP should be about the long-term community needs of the community, and should be about that sort of stuff and not about who pays rates next year. And so rating review as part of an LTP can be particularly distracting from the right debate. So this process that we're designing here has consultation late next year. That's right, wasn't it? Late next year, with a view to it being all set and done by December, wasn't it? And then integrated into, yeah. So what I found works is that you consult on the principles of what you're doing, and then you write the technical documents and incorporate them in the 10-year plan. No point consulting on the technical documents because the community doesn't understand that. It's boxes we've got to tick. But the government says we've got to consult on them, so we consult on them.
Can't it be balanced though? Like, obviously, there's a lot of people we can consult, we might want to do what they might want to do, but actually there's a lot of people who are actually interested to know what the effect of that would be on rates at the same time. And I know it's a little bit difficult to work out on the hop, but you can get a bit of an idea. And so don't you think the two go hand in hand to a little bit of an extent?
Oh, no, absolutely, you're right. When you consult on the changes of what you're doing, you talk about what you do, why you're doing, and how it's going to affect people. I'd always recommend that you do any rates review, you do your modelling on the whole database, and that you look to communicate as much as you can personally with the ratepayers about the effect on them. And so that you would be writing a letter to each ratepayer saying, your rates are currently this, and as a result of our change in the allocation of rates across the district, your rates are now going to be this. And that allows them to be informed on the consultation. I mean, it results in high level of engagement, which can be challenging.
Is that not slightly in conflict with what you told us before though? I haven't quite got to it.
The technical policy is writing it up in a technical way. You consult on it in a non-technical way, but you still do all the work. Yeah. So that's what I was meaning. So yeah, thanks for the question, so I can clarify that. It's technically 2 different consultations, but I've not experienced the second consultation having any, it doesn't create submissions and things like that. It's 3-hour drive, yeah. Right. Yep.
And I appreciate Mr. Councillor Thompson's notion around, community engagement space, because within changing community spaces, there have been those who, whilst we go out there with trying to not make it too technical so that people can have dialogue, and because language is a barrier. I think it's important though that because councils are always challenged in their transparency, especially around finances. So I think it's an important aspect to note there are those in parts of community who've always felt that, we're never really a part of that conversation. So the social engagement, council engagement, because I've seen that occur in a space where council has engaged a community, and a number of them are small business owners that do understand prudence, fiscal requirements, rates, but they've often felt that council doesn't think they do. So I think we're seeing a changing atmosphere, climate in that space of the knowledge we give out, but managing it, as you say, it's about taking the technical so most benefit the whole community, understand it.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen a fair change in that since being on council, actually.
So we're a long way away from making decisions about engagement and stuff like that. We haven't even decided to change anything yet. But when we do, it's certainly my preference that we don't be consulting on technical stuff, that we are consulting in a way that the people we're talking to understand, and they pretty much all understand money.
Just for the record, sorry to interrupt here, I can see Councillor Stoltz wants to go to.
I was also putting my apology for lateness to the mayor, who just seems smiley face. Anyway, yes.
But I'm just for the record, for live streaming, Councillor Burdett, Councillor Stoltz and CEO Nadine Thatcher Swan are going to Tier Royal for the consultation meeting. Okay.
So sources of funds. So I talked about the 12 sources of funds. They're listed in the Act. And we need to identify which of these sources of funds we're going to use to fund an activity for its operating expenses and its capital expenses. So we need to say whether an activity is going to be funded from general rates. There's two general rates. There's only two general rates, and that's the general rate and the UAGC, the Uniform Annual General Charge. They're both general rates. Within the policy, we are required to state the valuation system, capital value, differential rating, and whether you're using differential rating as part of that or not, and whether you've got a Uniform Annual General Charge or not. You're not required to state the amount. You're not required to state how the differentials are calculated. You're not required to state. No, I'll leave that list there. And then you're required to state. In fact, I'll go back a bit. It helps the whole process if we understand each of these funding sources and what our preference for using it is. So as part of the revenue financing policy, we look at all of these options and we decide what our preference for using these options are. And we do that, and then we go and do our funding needs analysis and we apply that preference to the activities. And then we come back to the revenue financing policy and undertake our 1013B, our step 2 analysis. So we have to state when we're doing our step 1 analysis whether we're going to collect targeted rates or not. The Act doesn't say that we have to specify what that targeted rate is. We can deal with that later. Lump sum contributions, not that commonly used anymore, used to be quite commonly used. And so that's when you do a surge scheme and you give everyone who's going to connect to the surge scheme an option to pay a lump sum contribution towards the capital cost. Last lump sum contribution I was involved in many years ago was $10,000 down in Mulraki, and you write the very strict process. You write to everyone, and they have an opportunity to elect to pay a lump sum contribution or not. And if they do, they have to pay it. If they elect to pay, they have to pay it. And then you don't rate them for the capital cost.
That wouldn't be so favourable now with low interest rates, though, would it? Because that would be the only advantage of paying a lump sum.
As an advisor to council, if they've got a mortgage, they're better off paying it off the mortgage generally. But the other thing is, with the Chamber of Commerce hat on, it takes a hell of a lot of money out of the economy that affects businesses, and that's something that I'd recommend a council consider. Because suddenly fridges and cars and other things don't get bought when people make that. So it's not a very common, I can't think of a recent example where it's been used, but it's in the list. Fees and charges, we all know about fees and charges. Interest and dividends, that should be fairly clear. Borrowing, debt, that's fairly clear. Proceeds from the sale of assets. A lot of councils in their investment policy or in their revenue and financing policy, and this is where you got to be really careful. Say these things once, because if you start saying them multiple times over the different policies, you can end up contradicting yourself through a typo or something like that. Forget to put a not in. But a lot of councils decide that the proceeds from sale of assets goes to paying debt in advance, and then they sell an asset and have a great debate about what they're going to do with the money. Development contributions, fairly straightforward. Financial contributions under the RMA won't exist by the time we adopt this policy, so that clause will get taken out, I suppose, at some point in time. Grants and subsidies, of course, our biggest funding source in there is NZTA subsidy, massive amount of money, really important funding source. It's a tricky one for some activities because you don't know whether someone's going to come along and give you some money to fund the operating costs. And so in that case, the policy needs to be written with recognition if we don't know what we don't know, and you're not going to turn down money because it's outside policy. That would be dumb. So we've got to make sure the policy recognises that sort of thing. Regional fuel tax. I presume you've got a fuel tax income. Yeah. And any other sources.
We haven't got a regional fuel tax, no.
Yeah, petrol tax. Most councils get petrol tax. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like Auckland where they have their own specific.
Oh, okay. So you're talking about that fund. Okay, right.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to ask, you said
It's
we
a little
won't
bit
turn
money.
down money. Is there any policy clause that says that we may turn down some money? I mean, in light of gambling policy spaces that have been challenged ethics-wise, but is within our framework as a council, have we got somewhere where we would say no to money that someone was going to give us?
There'd only be if it contravenes some of our other activities. I mean, but we don't actually say it in our policy. So if we were to do something that wasn't allowed by law or whatever, yeah, we would obviously not accept that.
Meaning, like, if someone wanted to give us some money and we found out that that money was got somehow untoward, tainted, so.
It comes.
Laundered money, for example.
Yeah, you've got to be careful of that is the Money Laundering Act, where if someone, in our requirements, if people are paying lump sums over a certain amount, there are certain prudence that we'd be looking at. How did you attain and what was the money came from? And we've got a bit of an obligation to look at that.
We don't get grants. We might get them to specific projects, but we don't get them to raise funds.
Yeah. Get the occasional bequest that might be for the operating costs of a. Not likely.
Some of the other things that we get sources of income are we like community housing rentals and maybe income from forestry assets held. But where would they sit in that? They'd be in the other source, would they?
Interesting dividends from investments. Forestry returns are a dividend from investment in forestry every year.
Yeah, I wouldn't have normally put lease income under fees and charges, but with you, yeah, other or, yeah, no, you're quite right. It's income that we need to recognise. Yeah. Yeah, so you got a community housing activity, the rental income's important, so you definitely talk about that specifically. And having, is it an activity in its own right?
Yes, it is, and that's because it's like user fees.
Yeah.
So therefore it comes under,
Fees
yeah,
and charges,
yeah.
No more questions on that list? So when we develop the policy, we'll develop what our intention is when we would choose to use whichever funding source. And then when we go and look at our activities, we'll apply that policy to that. Generally, most councils have a policy that rates is the funding source of last resort. We'll try to find other funding sources first. So the current revenue financing policies has a list of policy principles, reduce the complexity and the ratepayer impact, reduce administration and costs of implementation.
When you say, like, obviously complexity is an issue, but how do you relate to ratepayer impact? Because we have to collect so much money, X amount of rates, and they're going to impact on someone, aren't they? So how are you going to reduce impact? The only thing is you could change the incidence of impact to some people. That would be the only.
I think that's a really fundamental thing to understand with the rates review. When we look at the rates, all we're doing is reallocating the cost. The only way to reduce the cost is to spend less.
That's exactly right. So that's,
Or find another revenue source.
that's right.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a.
I think I did. This is quoting your policy. It's staff, the council adopted.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
So reducing ratepayer impact really should be done at the LTP. Really, that's the one where.
Which is
you
when this policy was developed as part of that. Yeah. So I think a really important part of what we do in developing a new policy is principles, So we've got a principle-based policy. And so we will revisit what are the appropriate principles at a later date. But potentially you're identifying something we need to look at. Consistency of application, phased implementation of major changes if necessary to lessen the impacts, achieve fairness and equity, increase use of fees and charges, the use of beneficiaries and user pays through targeted rates where appropriate, consideration of the public good element. So technical word that public good versus private good is one of the things that is part of the funding needs analysis step one approach. Council will consider under the benefit thing is whether part of that benefit is to the district as a whole or to part of the district or to individuals. And when it's to individuals, it's considered a private good. And when it's to the district as a whole, it's considered a public good. So that's where that language comes from. Allow the UAGC to be used as a lever to smooth rates when appropriate. I'm not sure how you've applied that here. While I said Hamilton City was 100% capital value, this year they introduced a UAGC for the first time because when they go to 100% capital value, the richest people, the most expensive houses pay the highest rates of any house of that value in the country, and the least expensive houses pay the lowest rates of anyone in the country. And so the UAGC tilted the line to be more in line with, in their case, Christchurch and the other cities that they were comparing themselves with.
Which council were you talking about?
That was Hamilton.
Hamilton.
Yeah, so they introduced the UAGC for the first time, and to my knowledge, in their history, since once they became a city. Targeted rates on an inner and outer zone as appropriate. So that's the use of area. And general rates on capital value where appropriate. I've highlighted on there the word appropriate because that's the word the Act uses. And it's for council to determine what is appropriate. And it's and no one else can challenge council's decision on appropriateness. So long as you've followed it and you've done all the steps and you've considered all the things you're required to consider, what you decide, having considered that as a group, is essentially not challengeable. The steps in the process is challengeable. I've highlighted fairness and equity because it's probably one of many things you consider inappropriate. Fairness and equity is very much in the eye of the beholder. And depending on your view of the world and your experiences in the world, you'll have a different view of fairness and equity. So I like to use appropriate because that's why you're elected. That's a choice you make, having taken into account everything that you're allowed to take into account. Both the minimum things you have to take into account and anything else beyond that.
Just a question on that. You do need to document what you mean by appropriate?
Nope.
No?
Nope.
You probably should though, right? So you understand
You need to
why you
document-
arrived at appropriate.
You need to document all the things you considered before you decided what was appropriate. But I can't document what each one of you were thinking when you collectively decided what was there was appropriate.
Second bullet point. You know, I think you've almost got to put a flag on that too, so that reduce administration costs of implementation but where you could almost say where that counterbalances achieving fairness and equity. You know, like sometimes to achieve fairness and equity, you might need a slightly more complex administration and a few more costs, but you have to decide whether you'll get value out of that extra cost over on the field of fairness and equity. So,
but it's only one of a number of principles. That's the whole thing. It's just one of the principles that you consider.
So under 101, under the funding needs analysis, step one of the 5 things that you've got to consider is the efficiency of separate funding. So that's part of that. One of the things I found with principles is it's impossible for you to comply with, to meet all the principles all the time, this compromise. And I think that's part of what you're talking about. And so in drafting principles into a policy, I'd actually make a statement that as part of the final determination, there's got to be compromise across those, because you can't achieve all of those things in an equal way. So I've just highlighted some the detail of the policy is you know, there's a lot of stuff in here, and I just highlighted some things that I thought were keywords in your policy, and I'm not making any judgment on them, but they're words that often pop up in these policies. So predictability and certainty, we discussed that. Ratepayers like that. Consistency and flexibility. It's one of the things that I want to do is make sure that we've got the flexibility where we need the flexibility in the policy. So if we put something into a revenue and financing policy that shouldn't be in a revenue and financing policy and could be somewhere else, we actually take flexibility away from council, because they've then got to go through a process to change a revenue financing policy. So that's one of the things that is part of developing this. We're going to make sure that the flexibility the legislation gives us, that we use that where we can. Fairness and equity, including ability to pay, we've talked about that before. Direct relationships between users and service, coming back to those principles, there was a discussion about the beneficiary pays and user pays and things like that. And using targeted rates to reflect a user pays sort of things. And then there's a reference in there about that overall impact of the community, which is that section 1013, the FNA step 2 process. And I think that's an area that will develop a lot more as part of developing the policy. The funding needs analysis part of it, it covers the 5 considerations that are required to be covered adequately. There's this is in part 2 of the policy, which is hidden behind the little video thing there on the screen. So it covers the operating cost, but not the capital costs, and that's because the capital costs are covered in part 3. It's very detailed, it's very specific, but like I said, I talked about not limiting us by going beyond the policy. The current policy does go beyond the minimum legal requirements, and we'll look at that further down the track because it might be affecting our flexibility of choices. And then there's the general policy part of the document that covers the elements that covers capital and has a range of other policies around capital expenditure and depreciation. So that's all we're going to cover today on the revenue and financing policy. Any general questions about revenue and financing policy? Cool. Next slide, please. Such a chatty bunch. Like I said, it's dry.
Sorry? Well, you can, or you can
Got plenty of time. Go early.
go early. You want to have a break now? We'll just go and get one if you want one.
I think we're going to finish early.
Yeah, so we'll just carry on, yeah.
At the same time, eh? Oh, they've all left the table at the same time.
Yeah, I was thinking we'll just go up one at a time.
Yeah.
So you're going to follow through right, usually to the end of developing fully our revenue and financing policy.
It's not my choice, but
I don't know.
it's my understanding.
How is Stephen going to be here right through the whole process?
Yeah, we're hoping.
Yeah.
Hope he hasn't been put out somewhere else.
We better book him in then.
Yeah. So we're just trying to, we've got the schedule up this year.
I've got the schedule up to the election, and then we'll revisit it after that. New council might decide not to do anything.
No. Where did the others go? I asked a question, do you want a break? No, we'll carry on, and suddenly everyone's gone. Anyway, we're going to carry on, okay? We're carrying on.
Current rating system and remissions policies. We'll do the rating system first. So this is the first time. So the current revenue financing policy is quite a lot written about rates and not a lot about those other funding sources. So we're going to bring some balance to that in the conversation. And so this is the first time we've talked about rating, specifically in the Local Government Rating Act. The Local Government Rating Act provides that there are two types of rates. There is a general rate and a targeted rate. That's all there is. There are two general rates, the general rate and the Uniform Annual General Charge. Some councils calculate the Uniform Annual General Charge as a result of their activity analysis, and it's a very mathematical calculation. Other councils pick a number. They say, this is how much we need from general rates, and they pick a number, and that's what Hamilton did. They looked at what different numbers, how the different numbers changed that in order to get what they considered appropriate, and they picked a number. I think Christchurch City picks a number. Other places have a detailed calculation on which the answer is the UAGC, subject to the limits of the legislation. So there's no right way of doing it. There's choices that work for you. Targeted rates, huge range of options for targeted rates, and you can name a targeted rate anything you like, as long as it's got rate on the end. But that's every other sort of rate we have, including your metered water rates, a targeted rate, for example. Rates are set and assessed by council once each year. So if someone comes along halfway through a year, builds a house, then that house doesn't get rated under capital value until 1 July the next year. Not the same in some countries overseas. But that's how it works here in New Zealand, which is quite good. It's nice and easy to administer. It does mean, and I'm not sure what happens here, but for things like refuse services and that, you collect that off as a fee and charge if someone comes on. Is that what happens here?
If they haven't got their stickers, which are sent out to them in the mail, then they would buy their own.
By their own, yeah. So essentially fee and charge. And then they get rated the following year and get the stickers delivered. Yep. Rates are set and assessed based on the rating information database as at 30 June. For those councillors that have been around a lot longer, you might have heard about striking rates. That's the old Act pre-2002, piece of language that sometimes slips out of my mouth. Set and assessed is the correct technical words that we're supposed to use. The rating information database, there's two databases that we have. There's the district valuation roll prepared by our valuer, and then the rating information database. The rating information database has everything in the district valuation roll, but it can have additional information in the district than the DVR, district valuation roll. It's good practice that whenever we talk about rates, we talk about it GST inclusive. And that's because there's nothing more surprising to a residential ratepayer that they get a bill that's 15% more than what they thought it was going to be. So it's about who we're talking to. Funny thing is, it was only as a result of one of the court cases, as a result of Kaipara, that we finally had a court confirm that it was lawful to set rates GST inclusive. So ever since the 2002 Act, there's been a uncertainty as to whether setting rates GST inclusive was lawful, and it has now been confirmed by court. The threshold for challenging council is quite high, and so there's a lot of stuff in the rating funding space that is yet to be challenged. So, so long as we are consistent with the sector, we should be right. In most of the sector, set rates GST inclusive, but now we know it's okay, so it's good. There's two really important parts to the legislation, and it's two schedules, Schedule 2 and Schedule 3. Schedule 2 is categories of rateable land, and that is who pays. And there's 8 categories of rateable land that we can set rates on, and the 3 with the ticks are the ones we choose to use in the current policy. Every rate must identify the category, and every rate must identify the factor, which is the next slide. So we rate on the use of the land. Interestingly, there's nowhere in the legislation that defines the uses. Every council has to work out what residential means, what commercial means, or commercial and industrial, if there's a term that a lot of councils use, what rural means. Whatever you decide the use is, you need to decide how to define it. There are councils that, like I said, have no general rate. Waitaki District Council has no rates based on residential use. So when the paper or someone from Wellington asks, what are your average residential rates? Well, they actually don't have a residential category to calculate it. So when you see reports of average residential rates, just know that there's no definition of residential. We use the district valuation roll categories as the best way, as the policy at the moment. An interesting example of use at the moment is Auckland City have decided that they want to rate Airbnbs. But trying to identify Airbnbs is proving very challenging to them. So based on the data they've got, roughly, I think it's 30% of Airbnbs are being rated, mostly because they voluntarily declared that they were Airbnbs, which means 70% are still rated residential, and the ones that are rated Airbnbs are rated commercial. So that's just an example of the challenges of use. Another example that was experienced in Oamaru was interesting in the tyre business. The biggest seller of tyres in Oamaru was operating out of a bedroom, for want of another word. His turnover was so great that the other tyre, the bow repairs, the Firestones in town were complaining that they couldn't get tyres at the price he was selling them for. And not a single tyre arrived at the place that he operated because he's operating on the internet, and every tyre was delivered directly from the manufacturer to the supplier. In fact, one of the Chamber of Commerce stories that we talk about is the guy in Lower Hutt who got the tyres delivered within 20 minutes because the courier just happened to be there, as you know. So we're trying to make decisions around use, and particularly in the commercial world these days, where not all the shops are on the high street. And so we'll think about some of these things as we develop the policy.
Yeah, that use of land is quite often covered off by the valuation though, because the way it's valued before it comes to us onto our register is handled by the
Things are valued at their highest and best use, so their actual use might be different from what the category and the rating and the DVR is.
But by using the rating, that's a determinant that can't be argued by
Quite right.
the ratepayers, whereas then we don't make that determination. We use something that's determined by a third party that we can stand by.
Yes. Yep. And there's a lot of reasons for liking that. I just wanted to point out though that there are choices.
Yeah.
Okay. Provision and availability of to the land of a council service. So the examples there in the briefing paper. Have them here somewhere. Wastewater. Why can't I read that in here?
You had it on your slide. Excuse me, no, it was wastewater, wasn't it? Wastewater connection, water connections, the same provision of availability.
Yeah, if you've got a connection, you write it on, if you've got a connection, it's not usually over.
Oh, it's in the notes to the slide, which I haven't got. That's why. I'm going to have to remember. Yep. Where the land is situated, so you got a number of rates based on location, and you've got the inner and outer zone, for example. And the factors, so the ones you're not using, area of land, so that's where you said every property that is less than 3 hectares will pay this rate. So remember, this is who pays. It's every property that has a certain area of land pays. No, because that's the factor, which is on the other list that we'll look at, because that's where every property within the hectares within the zone pays. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Annual value, up until the government created Auckland Council, Auckland City used to have annual value, but now no one uses annual value. And it's some technical thing based on lease prices. So good for a multi-level city, not good for the rest of us. Capital value and land value are all things we're familiar with. So the other half of it is calculating the factor. So now we know who pays, this determines what we pay. Annual value, we'll ignore that. So our current rating system, we collect rates, obviously the general rate by capital value, by land value. Sorry, we haven't got Fiona. Can you help me?
Land value plus the plants, capital value is UAGC. Sorry, not
yeah, it's there. So we multiply. Thanks. So land value was the pests and plants, for example. That's right. There's a rate that's still whatever your land value is. Water conservation, soil conservation. The value of improvements, no rates based on that. So the improvement value is the difference between your land value and your capital value as the value of improvements.
Who determines that it's an improvement?
This is part of the valuation rules. The area of the land, the drainage rate contributions are per hectare, and drainage rate direct beneficiaries per hectare. So you use area of land. So that means however many hectares you are, you'll pay the rate. Area land that is sealed or paved or built on is not used. You might use that for a stormwater rate, for example, where the paved area creates more water going into the storm, but I'm not familiar with it being used very often. The number of separately used inhabited parts or SUPs or SUPs, you use that for the UAGC. Another fascinating piece of legislation. When they introduced it, that's all that appeared in the legislation. And And I was a bit resistant to using it. And then a couple of years later, after some feedback, the government said, define it yourselves. So there's no single definition across the country of a SIP. Every council has its own definition. So, yeah, so having written the policy for the first time for Hamilton City, the challenge and the detail of define it. And, you know, I put up a slide to say, you know, how much do you want the staff peeking through the windows of people? The Auckland thing separates Airbnb from the rest of the house as a separately used inhabited part, for example. There have been, yeah. Yes, that's right. That's right. So. Granny flats are a problem. A lot of councils are happy to rate them as separately used. They don't care who lives in them, and others care who lives in them because it's a member of the family, and so they have a. Yeah. Well, you have that's right. You have the option to define the policy to exclude it, or you have the option to include it and then remit it. So you got two ways of solving that problem with granny flats. So the point here is you've got to define it, and that can be challenging. Extent of a provision of any service to the land, and that example of that is you might have two different sizes of water supply. Yeah, what was the example we had? Rubbish. It was rubbish. It was rubbish. The blue versus the. Yeah. The extent. Where did I go to? I've missed 8, 9. The nature of the connection to the council reticulations. Oh, that water. The area of land that is protected by the amenity. So that's the. You've got a protection schemes. It's very much a regional council rate. Floor space of building, don't use that. Number of water closets or urinals, that's your sewerage rate. Legislation says a maximum of 1 per house per residential property, but for commercial properties, you can charge 1 for every toilet. Even if you've got waterless urinals.
Well, that wouldn't be fair.
All right, well, I've had that argument with the ratepayer.
Even a waterless urinal.
Yeah. The engineers argued that actually created more cost to the sewage system.
Okay.
Because the sewage system needs water for it to work. So they've got to add water to work because of your waterless urinals.
Okay.
Yeah, anyhow. Rating maps. So you've got a range of rating maps. DRA stands for District Rating Area, I'm told, and some of those maps go back a very long time. Technically, each year when you adopt your policy, you essentially adopt a new set of maps. So they're not. So the choice to use those maps every year is a choice that you have. The legislation that created those in the first place no longer applies. So you're just choosing to use those as a choice, and the inner zone, outer zone is obviously the new one. So I quite personally, I like maps because it's very clear you're either in or out. Yeah. And this is just some information on your rates. Generally, 7% of your rate is collected from the general rate, 4.7 million. It's not a large rate in the context of things. UAGC collects 25% of all your rates, or $7.2 million of revenue. And that means $47 million worth of revenue is coming from targeted rates, or 68% of all rates. And targeted rates, that's just a sort of rough summary of how the targeted rates use capital value, land value, etc. Those factors that we went through. 12 of the rates, targeted rates, are fixed, and that they're for a fixed dollar amount, $220 or whatever that is, and 22 are based on a unit of measure, whether that's capital value or land value. All up, this current year, collecting 68.9 million, excluding penalties. Nothing more to say there. Rates remission policies. Must have a rate remission policy for the postponement of, for the remission and postponement of rates on freehold land, which you have, and may have remission policy on postponement policies. A change to the policy must be consulted on. Taupo got caught out a couple of years ago. They introduced a substantial change to the rating system, and then decided after feedback that they wanted to address some things and by adding a new remission, and they had to then do a whole separate consultation to do that remission very late in the piece, and it's a special consultative procedure, so it has to be a month. So I recommend, if you're doing a rate review, whether you're changing your remissions policy or not, you reconsult on your remissions policy, because once you've consulted on it, you can change it. As a consequence of hearing submissions about a problem with the rating system, you can then change the remission policy. If you haven't consulted on it, you've got a delay in setting your rates while you consult on a remissions policy. So that's just a procedural thing that will make sure we don't catch up, because often you don't know what the remissions are until you've got the feedback from the community of where the problems might need addressing. Remissions policies are required under the Act to be reviewed every 6 years. Practically, you do it at each LTP. A remission policy must state the objectives sought by the remission, the conditions and criteria to have those rates remitted. That's pretty easy. You can have remissions remitted by simple decision that this policy, this property qualifies, the definition in the policy, that a policy that looks like this qualifies, and so staff just apply the remission. Or you can have it as a process of you must apply and you must meet certain criteria. Lots of flexibility to make it as hard or difficult for someone to get a remission as you want. Current policy is 22, current policy costs almost $600,000. And so when you're remitting rates, because you've got a requirement to collect enough revenue to balance the books, then when the remission of rates is a cost, you then need to reallocate that cost against the other rate payers. So someone's paying for the remission. I think it's something you should consider. There might be a case that, you might decide to put it against everyone in the general rate. You might decide that a remission of a particular targeted rate is paid for by the other users of that targeted rate.
That's like the dog control fund that Councillor Princeton mentioned earlier. If you do that, then the good dog owners, I'm just using it hypothetical, the good dog owners are paying for the bad dog owners, whereas, and I think a bit of that happens, but then we do recognise that having good dog control has an element of public good.
Yeah, it's usual.
So it is a thorny one which needs to be considered in every individual case, doesn't it?
Yep. Yep. So I don't intend today to go through the 22 remission categories. I did pull out one because I'm not sure how familiar everyone is, but you can have a policy not to have a policy where there is a policy that you've got to have a policy.
That's the best.
I like it.
Yes, Minister. Quite common to not have a postponement policy. where you're required to have a postponement policy.
Just
Hello.
Just that one there, that you were asked before, just to have sort of the map of the Maori freehold land. That little snippet that you've got there does show it, but we will give greater details at other areas, but that is
Yeah.
basically part of it.
Yeah, I snipped that off a Te Puni Kokiri report.
So all our remissions on Maori land, it's also a GST issue with remissions. Is that still valid?
But that's not multiple owned Maori land, that's only Maori freehold land, isn't it? So it's two different categories.
Yeah, okay.
But GST remains the issue. The question's still valid.
Is an issue with remissions on it, where we have to pay the GST, even if we don't collect the money.
The issue that we've got is because we have about debt, and if we don't receive it, we still, when we invoice for the rates, we have to pay the GST at that particular point. So our point is saying, what is the issue for us, especially in those areas where we have high debt, and can we look at having that GST taken off on those particular ones? The interesting thing, when we did have a conferences up in Auckland, and the couple of recommendations, and because we were told we would never get it, and when it was saying, when it was infrastructure funding, what are the options for areas like us to have additional funding or help from central government? Their issues in Auckland is a lot greater. They have to look at other, they're at their capacity of debt, so they're looking at other special purpose vehicles to come up with other arrangements. And it was sort of said, well, what is the options for central government to help more of us? And one of them has said, well, I'd be looking at your GST on rates per se, not finishing just for Maori freehold land debt. And then the other, in Wellington themselves, so they are actually approaching central government as a sort of a strategy and a policy division that rates and GST themselves, that they're saying to them in their own negotiations that they should come off, and that should be given back to the council. So there is starting to be talk within the rest of the areas that this needs to be an issue, and maybe it's
Well, that's
kind of
why.
things.
That's partly why I was really interested in the rating review, that we actually accepted the LGNZ submission on the rate review, because the last time we had a rate review, two other people here will remember, we actually did some work with BDO to see whether it was going to be worth seeking to have the GST on rates removed. But it was at that time, which was probably ahead of its time, probably 10, 12 years ago, they determined that it wasn't going to be valid. It wasn't going to get any mileage putting it up. But just back to that map, we should, it would be useful to show multiple owned Maori land on a map as well, separate colour, so that we understand, because in actual fact, the rates and remissions are treated the same, aren't they? It ends up falls under the council rate remission policies for Maori land per se, both multiple owned and freehold Maori land.
And we're trying to also, I don't know how, and Fiona might roll her eyes at me, but I'm trying to also, as a different colour, what is landlocked.
Yes.
And so you've got a different picture that overlays, and you've got a bit of a difference with our region. What are we facing? And when you're having these decisions, you have those overlays. So that's where we come, and hoping to give you that degrees back at the next part where there's issues and opportunities, and you have those kind of visuals that you can see within the area. So that does lead to the next steps, which is the next workshop, which is saying probably about the 20th of June, but Heather's just got to confirm that. And it will be discussing, okay, what are our issues, and then that's the kind of also we have the feedback from yourselves, what you looking at, and what then are the other opportunities, what is other examples throughout New Zealand that may have other things that we could consider in the future. Then the part after the elections is when we get into our principle lead. So we've seen what our current principles are, then it's looking at what are the principles for the future. And that's when we start on those kind of things. And then we come back after those hiatus and start to do more of the evidence base that you actually have within our area. So that's the kind of the short term, and that's the sort of the frames that we've got.
Okay, so any final questions from anyone? Okay, if not, thanks very much, Stephen. You took us through in great detail there, and you didn't get many questions because I think everyone really understood what you were saying, and well, hopefully they did. And I guess as time goes on and we work through the whole process, where it gets a bit more exciting, where people are making decisions, well, I'm sure will be very productive. Okay, well, thank you, councillors, and I'll close the meeting.